Welcome. In this lesson, we are going to introduce staging as it applies to working with WordPress. Now let's get started with a few basic terms that will help us best understand and work with staging. First of all, a production site is your live site that people visit. Hopefully you've already worked with live WordPress sites, and if you haven't used staging, you might not refer to them as your production site, but that is what we are going to refer to as a production site. Then we have a staging site. And this is hosted just like your production site, although it's used for testing. So in a staging environment, if you wanted to add a section or some functionality or plug into your site, you would want to make sure that it works first on staging, which should be a close representation to your production site, and then you would push those changes from staging over to production once they were tested. So an important thing about staging is that it's not hosted on your computer. This is hosted with a hosting company, often the same hosting company that you use for your production site, and this allows for other people to visit that URL and see those changes that you're making. So while this is helpful for testing, it's not necessarily where we will do our development. And that brings in our local setup, which we have already looked at, which we will use for our development. So we have our production site, which is the live site. We will pull that down into staging and then make changes there, and then we could push it back to production. And then if we ever need to do any development, we'd pull from production down to staging into local, do our changes, and then push it back up through that same cycle. Now, when we talk about pushing and pulling files, we're actually referring to two separate things: files and database records. So in our first couple examples, we'll just do all of them together, both database and files, but we'll also talk about the specific differences between them and when you might want to push just one versus the other or not push something for a certain reason. So let's look at this flow a little bit more. We have our local development, our staging environment, and our production. We start off looking at production and staging together. The first thing we want to do is pull from our production site to our staging. This ensures that any testing or development work we're going to look at starts with a live example as close to possible as our site. Now, it might be that you don't need to pull from production every single time, but in general, this is a good principle. Before you work with staging, pull from production or create a new staging environment from scratch, which will also do the same. Then you go into your staging environment, which again is a different URL, but a complete mirror likely of your production site. And you make the changes there that you want to make. You could see now that the staging site looks different than the production one. And once you get sign off and everything looks good and is tested, you could then push those changes from staging into production. This is what we refer to as the production and staging process. Now, to handle this, we are going to rely on our hosting provider. Most good WordPress hosting providers offer staging. And that will mean that the same people who we are trusting with our site itself, we're also leveraging them to set up staging environments for us, and most of them make it as simple as just a few clicks in the admin area or even from within WordPress. So using a hosting company with staging covers half this. We then have to talk about production and staging along with local development. Now in this scenario, you would pull from production down into staging and then down locally onto your computer. This way, if you go to add a new feature to the site, you're starting with the same site that is being used live in production. Now, as with staging, sometimes it may be the case that you don't want to pull down everything, but in general, this is the practice. So then you would do any coding, like for a plugin or a theme or some feature that you're adding or some styles that you're changing. And then once everything looks good, you would push that up to staging for testing. So this is where you could give the client a link that isn't affecting your main site and just has the new features or designs that you want to test. Again, this can be behind a password protected login or something like that, so it's not visible to the general public. Then once you get sign off in staging, you would again push to production. Now we already looked at how the production to staging process is going to be handled by our hosting company. So now we have to talk about the local to staging process, which we are going to leverage plugins to help us solve. Now with the local to staging process, it is possible for us to manually transfer our files and our database via something like Git or SFTP or a MySQL admin interface. However, it's also quite easy to use a migration plugin to download a backup of your site from local and then upload it into staging, replacing everything that was there with what you have in local development. Now you'll note here that we do have two different processes in place. We have the production to staging, which is handled by our hosting, and the staging to local, which is handled by our plugins. And you may ask, is it possible to bundle all of these and do it as one? And really, for most developers working in different environments, it's a good practice to know how to handle both of these stages separately so that you're never stuck in a scenario where you don't know how to handle something or work with changes. Now, in relation to making changes, we talked about files and database records. When we talk about files, we're referring to our themes, plugins, and our media. Now, our themes, as you probably already know, live in our WP content folder inside of a themes folder, and these are files on the actual server or on our local development setup. The same is true for plugins. This is also true for when we upload media. It is then stored in an uploads folder also inside WP content. So all of these collectively, and maybe a few other things here and there like core WordPress files, these are referred to as files. However, we then have database records, and this is things like our actual content. So when we load a site on WordPress and we look at a page or a post, all of that content, besides the media, is going to be stored in a database. The same is true for settings. This might be a setting like the name of our site, or something to configure a plugin, or maybe even your theme has settings available for it. All of these settings are also going to be stored in the database. Now, oftentimes we could ignore the differences between these and just transfer both of these down the chain and up the chain together. However, there are a few instances when you might not want to or need to do that. For example, let's say that we just went in and changed some CSS in a theme. There wouldn't be a need to change the database or to migrate the database, so we could just migrate the files themselves. Now, in another scenario where we install a new plugin, you might think, okay, that plugin is just files, so we could just transfer the files. However, if that plugin had certain settings that you set up or had content with it, that would be stored in the database, so you would need to transfer both. The one thing you want to be careful about with database overrides is if you have a site where people are constantly adding data to it and the production site has changed since the staging site was last pulled from it. In a case like this, you might need to just transfer your theme or plugin files on their own without transferring the database and then manually configure the plugin settings. As you get more comfortable with staging, you'll begin to learn more about this process. But I encourage you to review everything up to this point because it should really give you a good foundation to understand what we're going to do next when we put all of this into practice and look at setting up this staging workflow. In order to work with this process, we will first need our local development setup. So if you haven't got comfortable with it already, I suggest you go back and rewatch the videos on local development and get set up with either desktop server or local. Then we need a hosting provider with staging. This will handle our production and staging workflow. Finally, we need a migration plugin that will handle the transfer of our sites between staging and our local development. One good way to get an idea of some of the WordPress hosting companies out there that offer staging is to look at the wordpress.org/hosting page, where they recommend a few of the big names in hosting. In order to demonstrate the staging, production, and local development workflow, I'm going to be using an account from Bluehost, which has staging built into all of its plans. Now, what you see may be a little bit different than what you have. However, as long as you have staging built into your hosting, you should see something very similar. Now, I will point out that one of the reasons I use Bluehost is because it has the most affordable plans that also offer staging out of the box. So to demonstrate what we need, it's a really great example. Also, after reaching out to them, they offered a special deal for students of this course. And it's important that I point out that this is not an affiliate page. So if you choose to host with them, I'm not going to get paid based on you signing up with them. However, I will be using them, and I wouldn't recommend them if I didn't think it was a good viable option for hosting your WordPress site and getting a staging environment. So that takes care of the hosting. We're also going to need a plugin to take care of the staging to local development workflow. Now, just like with hosting, there are many different plugins, but the one we're going to use is called the All-in-One WP Migration. And the reason for picking this one is that it's supported, often updated, free, and does exactly what we need of allowing us to easily export our site from development or staging, swap what needs to be done, and get that entire staging to local development workflow with just a couple of clicks. So before you proceed to the next lesson, make sure you go ahead and set up these three things. You're going to need local development setup, a hosting provider with staging, and a migration plugin in order to follow along. Now you could use a different setup than I'll be showing, and there should be enough general similarities that you should be able to follow along with. But for this example, I'm going to be using local for local development, Bluehost for the hosting provider with staging, and the WP all-in-one migration plugin for the migration plugin. So go ahead and get yourself set up. You might even want to rewatch this lesson, and then we'll see you in the next one where we'll look at putting all of this into action.